My name is David Wilkins, and I'm a professor at Harvard Law School, and I want to talk for a few minutes about reimagining lawyering in a world on fire. We are undergoing not one, not two, but three simultaneous crises: a global public health crisis, an increasingly global economic crisis, and growing global calls for social and racial justice. And all three of these crises have exposed deep structural challenges that had existed long before the current situation and were setting the world on fire, as my colleague Rebecca Henderson, a university professor at Harvard, has written in an important new book, Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. And all of these deep structural challenges will exist long after the current sense of urgency has faded. And as I want to emphasize, all of these challenges have major implications for the legal profession, and even more importantly, for a society that depends on lawyers to provide access to justice and the rule of law. So let's just consider just a few of the challenges that COVID is creating. How should we redesign courts and other legal institutions that will undoubtedly have to function in a hybrid world in the future? Or how do we protect fundamental rights like the right to privacy in a world in which we know that these considerations must be balanced against public health? Or what will it take to ensure fairness and equal access to everything from government benefits to vaccines? How do we jumpstart economic development and ensure that business and government work collaboratively to develop, navigate, and enforce sensible regulatory policy? How do we take this moment to advance global governance that promotes global solutions to what are clearly global problems, and yet ensures that the benefits of globalization are more evenly distributed than they have been in the past? Look, all of these challenges will undoubtedly require new laws and new regulations. And yet, law is only a part, and often not the most important part, of solving these complex problems. To address these pressing concerns, we're going to need lawyers who understand that they have to provide more than just a service. They need to also be part of creating solutions to complex problems that extend far beyond law. And as the pandemic and the protests have laid bare, these deep structural inequalities that underlie the current crisis, it is equally clear that all of these solutions must be sustainable as well as equitable. Look, in order to do this, we're going to have to re-examine some of the fundamental orthodoxies in the way in which we think about both business and law. Let's start with business. In 1970, the famous economist Milton Friedman declared, quote, "The social responsibility of business is to increase profits," close quote, period, the end. Look, no company probably strictly adhered to this famous aphorism, but for more than half a century, very few CEOs and even few investors were willing to dispute the fundamental premise that the most important obligation of managers was to shareholders. Even before the current crisis, this taken for granted presumption was being challenged. In 2018, for example, BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager firm, declared that it would, quote, "look beyond the bottom line to invest in businesses that, quote, contribute to society." Or take the Business Roundtable, a very blue blood organization comprised of top business leaders. It said that it was going to amend its definition of the purpose of the corporation to make it clear that corporations have duties to all of the company's stakeholders, not just shareholders, including customers, employees, suppliers, communities. And in January of 2020, right before the world fell off the cliff, BlackRock issued a second letter, this time saying that it would immediately stop investing in companies that present, quote, a high sustainability risk. By highlighting, as I've been saying, the deep structural inequalities in everything from healthcare to employment, COVID will only accentuate this trend. And anybody who doubts that, in July of 2020, just a few months ago, the World Economic Forum, probably the premier business gathering anywhere, called for a, quote, great reset of capitalism in the wake of the pandemic. To paraphrase the title of a popular TV show here in my country, the United States, was called Orange is the New Black. Perhaps green is rapidly becoming the new black. But since the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor here in the United States and the corresponding protests and movements it set off around the world, it is now clear that racial and social justice must be a part of this broader sustainability agenda. And for once, global companies are now putting real resources behind this commitment. It started, not surprisingly, with statements and symbols like banning the Confederate flag. But now many companies have gone further, putting billions of dollars behind funding racial justice organizations or creating hiring and supplier diversity programs, or even sustainability bonds and investing, such as Google's parent Alphabet, which just floated a $7 billion sustainability bond with hundreds of millions of dollars dedicated to minority entrepreneurs and minority artists. To stick with the metaphor, perhaps now black is becoming the new green. And the metaphor is apt, I would argue, because of the people who are pushing for these important new initiatives. Many of them are the product of the significant leadership and effort by a group of people who had been given the opportunity by the civil rights movement in my country or similar movements to open up the doors of opportunity to higher education around the world. And these talented women and men are now in positions of real authority and power. And while there are not as many as we would like, their voices are becoming increasingly important, particularly with other leaders and policymakers in the C-suites, of corporations, who realize the unsustainability of what Henderson calls in this important new book, extractive capitalism, in which a smaller and smaller share of society is controlling an ever larger share of society's resources, destabilizing the very markets and institutions that businesses and other institutions ultimately need to survive. Look, amidst all the chaos of 2020, one of the most important developments that was overlooked is that this was the first year that Gen Zs graduated from college. Now, of course, it wasn't overlooked by the organizers of this symposium because many of them are from this generation. But when you put together millennials, who have been the subject of many discussions, and this new Gen Zs coming through our educational institutions, these combined already make up 38% of the workforce and will be over 50% of the workforce by the end of this decade. And we know that these are people who are born digital, as my colleague John Palfrey wrote in a book almost more than 10 years ago. And at the same time, they are increasingly seeking meaning and purpose, not just outside of work, but in their working lives itself. And the pandemic and the protests that we have been going through will only heighten these dual commitments. And this is particularly important for the legal profession, which depends upon the legitimacy and the credibility of its connection to broader social purposes to attract and retain top talent. But if the legal profession is going to do this, it's going to have to rethink some of its own sacred presumptions. 5 years after Milton Friedman made that famous quote that I quoted before, the philosopher Richard Wasserstrom wrote a very important essay in which he worried that the traditional understanding that lawyers put the interests of their clients above all others renders the lawyer, quote, at best amoral, and at worst more than occasionally immoral in their dealings with the rest of mankind. As Wasserstrom argued, this role morality, as he called it, encourages lawyers to be, quote, competitive rather than cooperative, aggressive rather than accommodating, ruthless rather than compassionate, pragmatic rather than principled. It is neither accidental nor unimportant, Wasserstrom said, that these are the same character traits that are emphasized and valued by the capitalistic ethic. And anyone wondering whether this matters to anyone other than lawyers need look no further than the actions or inactions of some of the world's most prestigious lawyers in everything from the events leading up to the global financial crisis to the recent Volkswagen admissions scandal, or in my country, the willingness of so many lawyers, prominent lawyers, to embrace President Trump's baseless claims of election fraud. Needless to say, moving beyond this traditional mindset will not be easy. But it begins by understanding that lawyers are not just technical experts who provide their clients with access to the complex machinery of the law. Instead, as I argued in an essay with Ben Heineman, the former general counsel of General Electric, and Bill Lee, the former managing partner of a prominent law firm here in the US called Wilner Hale, we argued that lawyers must also be both wise counselors and effective leaders. And in these capacities, the first question a lawyer must ask always is it legal? But the last question the lawyer must ask is it right? If the legal profession hopes to continue to attract talented women and men, like the one here at Oxford, it must demonstrate that legal work provides meaning and the possibility of achieving a sustainable integration of the professional and the personal. This means that great law schools like mine and Oxford must not only teach students how to think like a lawyer or the core competencies of law, but they must also teach a broader set of what we called in the article I referenced before, complementary competencies, things like financial literacy, a basic understanding of information technology, cross-cultural fluency, problem solving in the face of uncertainty. These are the skills that will allow lawyers to contribute to solving the multiplicity of urgent problems at the intersection of law, business, technology, public policy, and morality that we now face. So here's the question. Will the profession rise to the challenge? Look, there's no guarantee. We've been down this road before. We've heard many of these criticisms before. But the forces pushing for change this time are especially urgent. COVID has underscored both the interdependence and the fragility of our society. And both the pandemic and the protests make clear that this interdependency and fragility is fundamentally linked to issues of inequality and social justice. I am very hopeful that our current crisis will produce a new and even greater generation who will want to tackle the even more difficult problems at the intersection of sustainability and social justice that our world now faces. So the bar, as I say, faces a choice. As we used to say in the 1960s, lawyers can either be part of the solution or part of the problem. The bar can choose to do what we often do in times of crisis, which is to retrench and to retreat to comfortable and established ways of working. Or we could decide to challenge ourselves, to build and expand, to meet the new challenges of the new future. In his brilliant and prescient recent book, On Tyranny, the Yale historian Timothy Snyder makes this very important point. He says, institutions do not protect themselves. They fall one after another unless each is defended from the beginning. So Snyder urges us to choose an institution you care about, a court, a newspaper, a law, a labor union, and take its side. For those of you who will choose to become lawyers, I hope you will join together and join me in taking the legal profession's side at this critical time in its history, both by supporting the best of the profession's traditions, but equally importantly, by challenging the profession to confront its traditional limitations. As the recent events in my country have made plain, all of our futures may depend on it.